What do you need to know about the 1031 exchange? Some believe that it's one of the most powerful wealth building tools still available today. For many reasons, it's the central topic for our discussions here on the 1031 show. And today we're going to get you up to speed on the history of this sometimes complicated part of the tax code, as well as the rules, regulations, and important things to consider if a 1031 exchange might be in your future. Join us for another must-see episode of the 1031 show. This history of the 1031 exchange goes back just about 100 years. In that time, there have been many developments that are important to know about since they give us valuable insight into the logic and thinking behind the lawmakers who put together our tax code. The origin of the 1031 exchange is interesting. The income tax started in 1913. People had done property exchanges regularly. Think of a farmer having a barley field and then that other farmer having a cornfield, and they wanted to exchange properties. Well, they could meet at the back fence and exchange deeds, and that was truly a like-kind exchange. In the Revenue Act of 1921, that was only 8 years after the income tax started. That's really where tax deferral was first put into the code, and it was in Section 202C, and that was to codify the idea of doing a like-kind exchange. But like-kind at that time really just meant investment for investment, one kind of an investment for another. And you had a wide variety. It wasn't just limited to real estate. You could end up with a piece of art or equipment or various kinds of property. So that was in 1921. They started to get a little more specific about it. And again, the income tax wasn't even 10, 11 years old. In 1924, they got rid of exchanges that were not like-kind. And so it really needed to be, at that point, a piece of real estate for a piece of real estate. There were, as always, the lawmakers like to see where everybody's going so they can then choose to lead them there. In 1935 was really the first case where a qualified intermediary was used. Now, we're going to get into what that means and exactly how a qualified intermediary works. But that was the first time that was used to transfer cash value in the sale of an exchange. And it still wasn't a 1031 exchange until 1954, and that's when the tax code was amended, and they introduced Section 1031 as the portion of the tax code that would represent tax deferral of all like-kind exchanges. So the 1031 exchange was created by the Internal Revenue Code. It was put into the code, Section 1031, in 1954. The rules started to get very much better defined after that. In 1979, there was a very prominent case that was called the Starker versus IRS. And in fact, some people still refer to a 1031 exchange as a Starker exchange. But what the IRS, what was upheld at that time, was that they actually completed an exchange within a 5-year window. So as a result of that, then the IRS started to clamp down and really establish some rules on how long you had to be able to do a 1031 exchange or like-kind exchange. The tax code in 1984, in the Deficit Reduction Act, they got very specific, and they said, okay, you're going to have a 45-day window to identify a property. And that 45-day window, it's not business days, those are calendar days. You have 45 days after selling a property to then be able, and that would be called the relinquished property. So you have 45 days to then identify the new property that you're going to exchange into. And then you have a total of 180 days after the sale to complete that exchange. So 45 days from when you sell to identify the new property, another 135 days after that to be able to complete that exchange. So, a high view, 1031 exchanges are all about deferring capital gains. It's deferring the gains so you can keep the capital intact in the investment. And again, going back to the beginning with farmers being able to know that they could exchange with a neighbor their field for another field and not have to give up part of it, not have to reduce the size of their capital, of their farm or their property to be able to pay taxes along the way. That was really an important part of capitalism, of building our country, of being able to maintain assets and build assets. And it's also worked out to be a tremendous wealth building tool, whether you're a farmer or not. But mostly it's used with real estate. And the ability to defer the capital gains to a later time or until you pass on, and then never have to have capital gains taxes paid on those gains because of the step up in basis. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Some of the other tax benefits that go along with owning real estate is being able to depreciate the real estate, and being able to use various methods of depreciation to be able to offset some of the income. So that's really a way that capital can be built. Property is appreciated, the property still has value, but we get to say that it is a wasting asset, it is diminishing in value each year, and we call that depreciation. So there was accelerated depreciation that could be used in the Tax Reform Act of 1986. They clarified that and really said, okay, we're going to have two kinds of depreciation depending upon the kind of property. If it's used for residential property, meaning people are living there, then it was 27.5-year depreciation schedule. So a $275,000 property would be able to depreciate over 27.5 years, would depreciate $10,000 a year of the amount that was put into it, or the amount that it was purchased for. And so that would come off as an expense against to offset income each year for 27.5 years. In contrast to commercial property, let's say a warehouse or manufacturing facility, an office for a professional, a dentist or a plumber, was going to be a 39-year depreciation schedule. So that happened in 86, and that's been great. It's really simplified a lot of the record keeping and the tax returns, knowing what the tax schedules are for the different type of property. So we should talk about foreign property and for tax deferral. That used to be something you could do. In 1989, they changed that and they restricted it so that the 1031 exchange and the like-kind exchange really only applies now to U.S.-based property that can be U.S. and the possessions for the states, the United States. So we do have folks who'll say, hey, I'd like to buy a property down in Belize. Can I do that? Or some other location. Not with a 1031 exchange. There are more updates, continually updating and clarifying. The 1990, the Treasury regulations, they clarified a 45-day identification window, a 180-day exchange window. Constructive receipt is a topic that we'll be talking on a little bit later. But that basically means, when do you receive the money? Because that's really what it's about. That's why we need to use a qualified intermediary in most exchanges, so that you can say, I did not take the money. It never came to me. If you receive the money, then you may not do an exchange. So it has to be another party. In this case, it's called a qualified party, a qualified intermediary, to receive that money. And there's some very specific rules on that. We'll end up doing a whole segment just on the qualified intermediary as well. There's safe harbor provisions that are put in place to basically give you clearance that if I do this or if I do that, or what the timing I'm doing, will that qualify as a 1031 exchange. They also clarified the partnership interest. You cannot do it you can't break apart a partnership. So one of the details is the entity that sells the property or owns the property also must be the entity that does the exchange and buys the new property. So some of the other rules that were clarified that year were the related party. So can you use the property, or can you have a rental property and then buy one, do a 1031 exchange to your kid going to college, and then have him stay in the property there. So they clarified the related party rules, and again, all these clarifications are good, so that eliminates really the fear of audit, the fear of having a problem with it. So there are a lot of different ways of doing exchanges. Typically, it is selling one property, think of a single-family rental or a duplex or a fourplex, selling that and then moving into a better location, or there are all sorts of reasons for why you might want to do an exchange. What happens if you want to you find a property but you haven't sold yours yet? Well, you can do that. It's a little bit more complicated, but we handle those for clients. We work with qualified intermediaries to do what's called a reverse exchange. And it's exactly what it sounds like. That's where you buy the exchange property first, and you have to do that through an arm's length transaction. A qualified intermediary will help with that. And then you sell your property. And again, there's timelines that govern when that has to be done, and with what time do you have to complete the reverse exchange. But there are ways to do that. That's a fairly common question that we get. So the reverse exchanges, those were clarified in revenue procedure back in 2000. In 2002, they clarified fractional interests, and that's going to be very important for a later section where we're talking about Delaware statutory trusts. I believe that's going to be in episode 4. So fulfilling 1031 exchanges, having a fractional interest in a property, that could be a partnership interest, joint tenants. You can have tenants in common. So we don't see those as often anymore. But all of those were clarified in 2002. Delaware Statutory Trust is a very specific and very powerful and very popular tool that's being used. Those came around in 2004, so that's almost 20 years ago. And so we'll have a whole episode dedicated just to how does the Delaware Statutory Trust work. So the Delaware Statutory Trust, that was Revenue Ruling 2004, that really clarified that and really opened up the floodgates for being able to do all sorts of deals, and ending up really allowing people to graduate from being active owners and operators of property to graduate to being real estate investors. That's a huge part of the chronology of people as they go through their ownership status, or the sequence as they mature into being real estate investors. Crowdfunding is huge. In 2012, the Jobs Act was another landmark time. This recognized the internet, recognized the information that's out there that people can find on the internet, and really clarified that you could use the internet to do crowdfunding to purchase securitized real estate. So that's something that we've seen a lot more of. There's a lot to be very cautious about with that, because there's 4 elements that really are quality elements that go into doing an exchange and finding exchange property. One of the important ones there is, who are you working with? As many people offering goods, services, and information on the internet, you have to be extremely careful, and you have to do your due diligence very well. But that was all made available in 2012. And we'll be talking about that more in, I think, episode 5. Now, we covered many of the rules and regulations during our history, but it is important to know what you're doing. So we're just going to go through the important bits in succession here. So the first one is that really, what is a 1031 exchange? It is exchanging one property for another. Like-kind exchange is what it's called, and for the purpose of holding it for investment or business purposes. So that's really what 1031 exchange definition is. But what is like-kind? We get a question often that I've got a duplex and I don't know if I'm going to be able to find another duplex. I like to joke about it and say, if you have a condo with a blue door, that doesn't mean you have to find another condo with a blue door somewhere. So there's a lot of latitude within like-kind exchanges with real estate. You can have farmland. It doesn't have to be income producing. It can be farmland that is just been in the family for generations, that's not producing any income, and maybe the family would like to. Maybe there's not going to be another generation that wants to be farmers. So you could do a like-kind exchange of that without having to incur the capital gain taxes now for grandma and grandpa, and be able to have that moved into professionally managed professional building, apartment building, medical building. There's all sorts of different market sectors. And again, that's a whole other section where we'll go through and describe all the sectors. But the like-kind exchange is pretty broad. You can exchange a lot of times we'll see a professional who may, again, let's say it's a plumber or an automotive shop, and the owner may own the business and the building and has the business rent the building or lease the building from the owner. So those are two separate entities. You have the business, and that's a sale, that's a transaction, but then so is the property itself. It's common to see this in franchises, in burger chains or restaurants, where the business is operating and it leases the property from the owner. So, like-kind exchange, I think some of the other examples we've seen, water rights. That's kind of an intangible thing, but being able to sell the water rights off or mineral rights from a property and exchange just that into another tangible property that is generating income. Investment properties then can be, we can do a like-kind exchange into an investment property as we described, and that can be, again, something that's bought and that you hold for a while, or you can move into a property that you're then going to develop. So it doesn't have to be for the like-kind exchange at the 1031. It can be any sort of investment, just has to be real estate, and then that's classified as an investment property at that point. So to do a like-kind exchange, we talked earlier about the qualified intermediary. This is extremely important. We'll do a whole episode on this, but for now, just recognize that you cannot take control. It's called constructive receipt. If you show up at closing and the title company cuts you a check and that money, or it's wired into your account, you can't do the exchange. You have now received it. Unfortunately, we get many requests, many questions that come through our various communications out there of people saying, hey, this sounds great. I sold my property a month ago. How do I do a 1031? Well, you don't. We do have other solutions for that. There are other tax advantage ways to help if you've missed the opportunity there. We joke about it a little bit. If somebody is driving to the closing and they forgot to set up their 1031 intermediary, give us a call. We'll get you in touch with somebody. We call that a 911 1031. That's an emergency, and yeah, it can happen very quickly. You just have to make sure, don't wait till the last minute. As soon as you're under contract is when we tell people to make sure you get your qualified intermediary set up. Constructive receipt is the important thing. Have you taken possession of the money? All we'll touch on right now is who is that? Does that mean that, well, no, I didn't, but my wife did? No, that's still considered you. How about a family member? Nope, that's still you. You've got constructive receipt. We run into it fairly often where people say, well, I've got my attorney. He's been taking care of my business for years and years, and I use him for everything. He said he'll be the qualified intermediary. No, we won't. Not with a successful exchange. If your attorney has been, if anybody, attorney, CPA, has been an agent of yours, has worked for you for the previous 24 months before the exchange, then they are considered your agent. And that means that they will do what you tell them to do. So if they receive the money, you've got constructive receipt of the funds. Be careful of that. Use the large firms. There are 3 or 4 or 5 nationwide that are very strong. We'll be happy to guide you. We're not a qualified intermediary firm, but we'd be happy to guide you to the best firms that are bonded, that are insured, because qualified intermediary is an unregulated industry. So we'll talk about that in a whole episode. One of the big rules with doing a successful 1031 exchange is the timelines. And I think this is what really disturbs a lot of people or makes them gun shy. They're afraid that, well, from when I sell, I know I've heard of 45 days. I've got to identify a property within 45 days, and I've got to close on that property. Some things to clarify. 45 days, it's a real deadline. If you have a qualified intermediary that tells you not to worry about it, then find another qualified intermediary. You don't want to run the risk of an audit. You don't want to blow up the exchange down the road, several years down the road, because you had a cooperative qualified intermediary. It's a 45-day window to identify the new property. And then 180 days from when you sell yours to when you close to be able to close on purchasing the new property. Those are real deadlines, real dates. Those are calendar days, not business days. If 45 day is on a Sunday, okay, it's on a Sunday. So it's a Sunday before midnight. You've got to identify that property. The timeline rules are something that are not difficult, just need to be respective of them. The other rule that confuses people often is property valuation rules. So what if you're not sure? You sold that condo with the blue door that I spoke of, and well, you found a single family home. You think you'd like to buy that. You're not sure. You still need some time to do your due diligence on it, but there are a couple of them, and maybe even another condo, and there's several properties. Well, you can go ahead and you can identify up to 3 properties, target properties that you may want to close on. If you identify more properties, you can't identify more than 200% of the value of the property you sold. So there's a lot of latitude there as well. And then there's a fallback position that says, well, you can identify whatever you want to identify, as much value as you want to, but you have to close on 95% of that which you identify. So that's if you go over the 3 property rule or over the 200% rule. A very important part of the 1031 exchange is that for a successful exchange, you have to replace 100% or more of the value. You have to go equal or up in the value of the property and also the value of any debt that's on the property. So if you have a $1 million property and it's got $200,000 worth of debt, then the property you exchange into has to be worth at least $1 million, and it has to carry at least $200,000 worth of debt. Now, there are many very attractive solutions that can get you out of debt yourself. We see that a lot. People have had property their whole life. They've been investors. They put together a handful of single-family homes or rentals, and they're ready to graduate into be real estate investors and get away from being owner-operators. And they also don't want to have debt anymore. Well, that's called non-recourse debt. That's part of one of the tools that we use called a Delaware Statutory Trust. It's a very specific kind of tool, very popular tool. Again, that was allowed and made a common part of the 1031 industry in 2004. But what happens with that is you get to move the debt. You still have the debt is transferred. It's still a successful exchange, but now you're not responsible for the debt. It's all wrapped into the deal, and that's called non-recourse debt. So ask us about that. Ask us how that works. What we've found is people say, well, I'll put the equity in, but I'm going to pay off the loan, and I don't want that. Well, if you do that, then that would be what's called boot. Now, boot is a very important topic. Boot is think of it this way. If the IRS is going to kick you, they're going to kick you with a boot. Okay, so if you have equity or you have debt that is not transferred into the new exchange, the amount of that is called boot, and that's taxable. So it's okay, but be aware of it. Let's say that you do a $1 million exchange and you only want to put $800,000. There's no debt on it. You put $800,000 into a new property and you take $200,000 as income. And those are long-term capital gains. You pay taxes on them. That would be called boot, $200,000 of taxable boot. So any equity that doesn't go in and any mortgage, any debt that doesn't go into the new exchange is also called boot. So happy to clarify that. A lot of people, they'll say, well, I think I understand, but what about my situation? Give us a call. We'll talk to you about that. We'll model it out for you and show what that looks like as you're with your own exchange. So a key part with a 1031 exchange and capital gains, and we call this the gotcha. So we want to close with that. The gotcha is depreciation recapture. You buy a property for $100,000, you depreciate it to zero over a number of years, and then you sell the property. Well, it's not just the capital gains you have to pay taxes on, it's also all that depreciation. You end up having 25% of that will then be taxable. So that's something, again, we'll model that. We'll show you how that works in your exchange. Some believe that the 1031 exchange is one of the most powerful wealth building tools still available today, but it can be very complicated to understand and to get right. That's why it's extremely important to understand what you're doing and to work with someone who can help to guide you through the process. We have resources available to help you and that you can find in our episode notes or on our website, depending on where you are enjoying this podcast. Take a look and please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm Wally Smith. Join us next time on the 1031 Show.
Impact 1031 is a DBA of Ridgegate Financial, LLC. Not an offer to buy nor a solicitation to sell securities. All investing involves risk. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Speak to your finance and/or tax professional prior to invest. Securities offered through Emerson Equity, LLC. Member FINRA SIPC. Only available in states where Emerson Equity, LLC is registered. Emerson Equity, LLC is not affiliated with any other entities identified in this communication. Investment advisory services offered through AE Wealth Management. Emerson Equity, Ridgegate Financial, and AE Wealth Management are not affiliated entities.